Healing a doctor's heart. Synopsis. On the day Dr. Chawin divorced his beautiful wife, he drowned himself in alcohol and endlessly reminisced about her. During this turbulent time, a curious young woman began visiting his home daily, delivering meals and cleaning as part of her duties. However, this overly inquisitive young woman, deeply fascinated by the doctor's unwavering devotion, inadvertently sparked a dramatic turn of events. One fateful night, she became his lover, a secret she tried her utmost to bury. But fate had other plans. She ended up carrying his child. Chapter 1. Dr. Chawin, or Dr. Mike, had recently become single after divorcing his stunningly beautiful wife. The cause of their separation remained a mystery, no matter how much the young nurse stationed outside his examination room tried to dig up the details to satisfy her curiosity. This newly single status of the doctor spurred the nurses to work harder than ever. They frequently made excuses to enter the examination room, just to catch a glimpse of Dr. Mike's flawless face, a sight that never failed to brighten their day. What no one knew, however, was the depth of the doctor's sorrow. His first love, so deeply ingrained in his heart, had been shattered beyond repair. He had tried to hold on to her, but when she begged for freedom to start anew, how could he deny the woman he had always loved? The only thing Mindira had asked for was a divorce. He gave it to her, tears streaming down his face, accompanied by a heartfelt wish for her happiness. "I wish you the best, Min. No matter where you are, please remember me. If you ever need me, I'll come running." He spent days in anguish, trying to come to terms with the reality of being alone. But solitude brought no solace. The spacious house was now devoid of life. Even the maid who had served Mindira had left with her. He was truly alone. Being an academic who excelled in his studies and later a doctor consumed by work, he knew little about anything else. Tasks as simple as cooking were beyond him, so he subscribed to a meal delivery service run by Aunt Pin. Every evening, her niece would deliver the meals. "Dr. Mike? Doctor, are you here?" The voice was as sweet and clear as a bell. Ritai, Aunt Pin's niece, entered the house carrying a tiffin carrier. Both of Ritai's parents had passed away, leaving her to live with her aunt since childhood. A diligent helper, she ensured that the two of them never lacked for food. The doctor's not here?" She wandered in and opened the door without hesitation, only to find Dr. Mike, still in his work clothes, sitting at the kitchen counter, visibly drunk. She hesitated, ready to retreat, but it was too late. The doctor's handsome, albeit inebriated, face turned toward her. "Who are you?" Normally, Aunt Pin instructed Ritai to drop the food at the door and leave, which meant the two had rarely exchanged glances. Yet, the young woman's boldness led her to encounter Dr. Mike in a vulnerable state, an image of heartbreak personified. Ritai surmised that the doctor was grieving his divorce. Instead of finding it annoying, her heart softened. She had a weakness for men's tears, and seeing the doctor looking so distraught and intoxicated deeply impressed her. "I'm Ritai. I brought you your meal." "Oh, just leave it on the table," he mumbled, pointing unsteadily to the empty surface. Ritai placed the tiffin carrier down but lingered, reluctant to leave. She wanted to observe the doctor in this heartbreakingly vulnerable state, so reminiscent of a tragic leading man in a drama. Thinking she had left, the doctor downed the rest of his bottle of liquor. He figured it didn't matter. Tomorrow was a day off, and he wouldn't have to work, so why not indulge? Everything unfolded before Ritai's wide eyes. At 22, she was a second-year business administration student, and her curious mind couldn't help but admire the doctor even more. If she had a lover who was as devoted and heartbroken as this. Oh, the thought sent shivers down her spine. "Wait, you're still here?" Caught off guard, Ritai quickly composed herself. An idea popped into her head. "Doctor, would you like to hire me to clean your house? It's starting to get dusty." Normally, she wasn't this industrious. In fact, she often slacked off. But today, something sparked a rare burst of enthusiasm. She wanted an excuse to stay and watch him a little longer. Dr. Mike, his thoughts clouded by alcohol, took longer than usual to process the suggestion. Eventually, he nodded, assuming she was in dire need of money. "Sure, go ahead." For convenience, he slid off the high chair, clutching his liquor bottle, and left the kitchen. Ritai felt a pang of disappointment but remained optimistic. This visit could be her ticket to getting closer to the doctor. Perhaps he'd start noticing her more. By the time she finished cleaning the sprawling house, she was exhausted. She hesitated to ask her employer for payment. As she prepared to leave, she had a sudden thought. No way I'm leaving empty-handed. I worked so hard. The doctor's room must be upstairs. Her eyes widened as she imagined stumbling upon the doctor mid-shower, wrapped in nothing but a towel. Just the fantasy was reward enough. Without hesitation, the mischievous young woman tiptoed up the stairs. While part of her was uncertain, her adventurous spirit won out. She stopped in front of a room where she could faintly hear the hum of the air conditioner. It had to be his. Doctor? Dr. Mike? I'm leaving now. Silence. But she was confident it was the right room. As she prepared to head back downstairs, a sudden crash startled her, freezing her in place. Crash. Doctor? Dr. Mike. She turned back to the door and flung it open. There he was, sprawled across the bed in his clothes, with a shattered liquor bottle on the floor beside him. Doctor? Doctor. The doctor's hand reached aimlessly into the air. Ritai's imagination ran wild. Perhaps he needed help. She stepped closer, her heart pounding. Min Daira. When she realized he was calling out to his ex-wife, a wave of pity washed over her. She wanted to comfort him, to hold him. Poor man, she sighed. But what could she do? Their lives were worlds apart. Her tiny home couldn't compare to his grand house. A little daydreaming would have to suffice. Having indulged her curiosity, Ritai decided to leave. Aunt Pin would be furious if she wasn't home by 9 p.m. Yet, as she turned to go, the doctor's despondent voice stopped her in her tracks. Don't go, please. Chapter 2. Ritai froze in place, staring at the doctor as he sat up, clutching his head with tears streaming down his face. He sobbed endlessly, calling out for the wife who had left him. Mindira, don't leave me. The usually strong Dr. Chawin was now a vulnerable man in his drunken state. Ritai sighed, her feelings a mix of nervous excitement and compassion as she realized this truth. She decided to walk away, determined to stop meddling in someone else's business. But just as the doctor attempted to get off the bed, he stepped on a shard of broken glass. Without hesitation, Ritai rushed back to him, helping him sit back down on the bed. Her heart raced with both fear and concern. The doctor, however, seemed unfazed by what had happened. Blood trickled from his foot as he reached out and wrapped his arms around Ritai, mistaking her for his former wife in his drunken haze. Min, I'm so sorry, he murmured. Doctor, it's me, Ritai, she stammered, trying to free herself from his grasp. But even in his inebriated state, the doctor's strength far exceeded hers. Stay with me, Min. I won't hurt you again. He leaned closer, resting his head on her shoulder. Ritai froze, unsure of how to respond. The closeness made her heart race uncontrollably, and she could feel her face heating up. Doctor, please, she whispered, trying to push him away gently. The doctor, lost in his own sorrow, seemed oblivious to her words. His actions, though unintentional, left Ritai overwhelmed and confused. She managed to calm him enough to have him lie down, but the experience left her shaken. As he lay beside her, Dr. Mike's expression softened. The traces of anguish and heartache seemed to fade, replaced by an innocence she hadn't seen before. He looked so peaceful and unguarded, and Ritai couldn't help but feel drawn to him. For the rest of the evening, she sat quietly, watching over him as he drifted into a deep sleep. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. This moment was far from anything she had expected, but it left an impression on her heart she couldn't deny. Even as she prepared to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling of empathy and admiration for the man she now saw not just as a doctor but as a human being burdened by pain and longing. Chapter 3. Doctor. Doctor, are you there? The loud calls and the sound of a doorbell ringing downstairs stirred Dr. Chawin from his sleep. The bright morning light stung his eyes as he sat up, his head pounding. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, trying to collect himself. Doctor. Are you home? Aunt Pin's voice echoed from below, prompting him to get out of bed. The sight before him made him freeze. Shards of broken glass were scattered on the floor, and his foot throbbed in pain. Fragmented memories began to surface. A hazy recollection of holding someone close, and then... His breath hitched as his eyes fell on the rumpled bed. Bloodstains were visible on the sheets. A wave of anxiety washed over him, tightening his chest. But he had to deal with Aunt Pin first. Wincing, he made his way downstairs, only to realize he was stark naked. Mortified, he quickly grabbed a robe before heading to the door. When he opened it, Aunt Pin greeted him with her usual boisterous energy, her questions coming rapid fire. "Doctor, good morning. Yesterday evening, my niece brought your meal over, but I don't know where she disappeared to. Did you happen to see her?" Dr. Chawin's heart raced. He forced a weak smile, his pale complexion making Aunt Pin assume he was unwell. "Your niece?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though his throat felt dry. "Yes, Ritai, the one who delivers your meals all the time," she replied. "Oh, I'm not sure," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Aunt Pin looked worried but nodded. "All right then, I won't bother you anymore. Sorry for disturbing you." "And no problem," he replied weakly. As soon as Aunt Pin left, he limped back upstairs, ignoring the pain in his foot. His gaze returned to the blood-stained sheets, and he groaned, overwhelmed with guilt and confusion. "What have you done, Chawin?" he muttered under his breath. He tried to piece together the events of the night before. Where had she gone? Was she okay? And worse, if something irreversible had happened, what if it led to unintended consequences? Was she even old enough? The questions piled up, suffocating him. Meanwhile, Ritai had woken up early, quickly dressing in her torn shirt from the previous night. She had slipped out of the house before Dr. Chawin woke up, hoping to avoid confrontation. Now, back at her aunt's home, she hid under her blanket, isolating herself in her room. Growing up without parents and being raised by a busy aunt, Ritai had always felt she had to shoulder responsibility for every problem, even when it wasn't her fault. It was a habit formed from a lack of emotional support. As she lay curled up, tears streamed down her face. She heard the creak of her bedroom door opening and flinched. But it was just Aunt Pin, who had returned from her search. "Ritai, where have you been?" Aunt Pin's scolding voice filled the room. Ritai didn't respond, burying herself further under the blanket. "What's wrong with you? Are you crying?" Aunt Pin asked, her tone softening as she noticed Ritai's swollen eyes. "No, I'm fine," Ritai lied, quickly wiping her tears. "Who hurt you? Tell me," Aunt Pin pressed. "No one. I just have a headache," Ritai replied, her voice barely steady. Aunt Pin looked skeptical. "You've never been one to cry, not even when you got bitten by that dog. If it's bad enough to make you cry, it must be serious." "It's just a headache," Ritai insisted. "I'll be fine after some rest." "All right, but if you're feeling better by noon, take the meal to the doctor's house, okay?" Aunt Pin said, leaving the room. The mention of Dr. Chawin made Ritai's stomach churn. How could she face him? Did he remember what happened? She had heard that drunk people often forget their actions. Maybe he wouldn't remember anything. At noon, Dr. Chawin, now with his foot bandaged, came downstairs to collect the new meal delivery. He handed the empty tiffin carrier from the previous day to Aunt Pin. When she asked how he found the food, he smiled faintly and replied, "It was delicious." In truth, he hadn't touched it and had thrown it out earlier that morning. Before Aunt Pin left, he hesitated and asked, "What's your niece's name again? And did you find her?" Aunt Pin sighed. "Her name's Ritai. I was so worried, but it turns out she was in her room all along. She must have come back late last night. You know how it is with us old folks, doctor. We don't notice things like we used to." "Oh, is she unwell?" he asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "She said she has a headache." "That girl's tough as nails, but it must be bad if it made her cry," Aunt Pin replied. Dr. Chawin's heart sank further. He wanted to make amends but had no idea how. "I have some medicine at home," he offered. "I'll bring it down for her." With that, he retreated into the house, his mind heavy with guilt. He felt an overwhelming need to make things right, yet he was haunted by the mystery of what had transpired. Had he truly been so drunk that he lost all control? Chapter 4. Back at home, Aunt Pin entered Ritai's small room, placing a bag of medicine from Dr. Mike on the bedside table along with an envelope containing her payment for cleaning the doctor's house. She gently patted her niece's head, feeling a wave of sympathy for the young woman who worked so hard. Ever since Ritai was old enough to understand, she had always helped her aunt. Whether it was light chores or heavy labor, she rarely complained. While she occasionally shirked duties and earned a scolding, Aunt Pin saw her as more than a niece. Ritai was like a daughter to her. Ritai opened her eyes, surprised to see tears welling up in her aunt's eyes. "Auntie, what's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing, my dear. How about you? Is your headache better?" Aunt Pin's tone was laced with concern. Ritai felt a lingering soreness throughout her body but was too scared to explain the truth. She worried her aunt might discover what had happened. "You've gone quiet. What's wrong with you now?" Aunt Pin teased lightly. "By the way, Dr. Mike sent you some medicine." "What?" Ritai sat up, startled. "Dr. Mike. When he heard you weren't feeling well, he was kind enough to send this over. Such a thoughtful man. Oh, and here's your payment for cleaning his house yesterday. Let's see. Wow, 1,000 baht. You should go back and clean again next time." "I'll allow it." Ritai shot upright, her messy hair framing her confused expression. "Did he say anything else, Auntie?" "Not much. Just asked what you're studying. When I told him you're in business administration, he said it was a good choice and that he's willing to help if you need anything." "All right. Auntie." Something about Aunt Pin's account unsettled Ritai. She couldn't help but wonder if the doctor remembered what had happened the night before. Her aunt stood up and stretched. "Well, I'm off to the market. Do you want anything? We've got money to spare now." "And no thanks. Make sure you wash up and eat something. You look like you haven't cleaned up in days," Aunt Pin instructed before leaving the room, leaving Ritai alone with her swirling thoughts. "Ritai, heading to school already?" Monday morning arrived, and Aunt Pin's voice echoed from outside. "Yes, Auntie," Ritai replied. "Can you drop off breakfast at the doctor's house on your way?" Ritai froze mid-motion. For the past few days, she had been avoiding any tasks that might lead her to encounter Dr. Mike. Now, her aunt's request made her heart race. "But Auntie, he's probably at the hospital today," she tried to protest. No. He's taking the day off. He told me yesterday evening that he's unwell. You can just hang it on the gate." I'm in a rush," Ritai stammered. "But his house is on your way to school," Aunt Pin countered. With no valid excuse left, Ritai found herself carrying the tiffin carrier to Dr. Mike's house. As she neared the iron gate, her heart pounded in her chest. She hesitated, peering through the bars to check if anyone was around. Leaving the food outside seemed risky. It could spoil quickly. Entering the property was even more daunting. Summoning her courage, she pressed the doorbell and waited for the doctor to appear. If she kept running away from her fears, she would be trapped by them forever. Perhaps facing him would reveal there was nothing to be afraid of after all. The doctor emerged from the house, still in his pajamas. His strides quickened when he spotted her standing with the tiffin. Ritai's anxiety spiked as she blurted out nervously. "Doctor, here's your breakfast. I'll just hang it here." Wait, hold on," he called out. She stopped as he unlocked the gate, her heart hammering. His curious gaze unsettled her further. "Heading to school?" he asked. "Yes, doctor," she replied, keeping her eyes lowered. Dr. Mike smiled warmly, which only made her more self-conscious. "The fish curry yesterday was delicious. Please thank Aunt Pin for me." "Of course," she answered, her voice barely audible. "Good luck at school. If I'm free, I might drop by your university sometime. Your name's Ritai, right?" Her heart lifted slightly. Did that mean he didn't remember? Feeling a bit braver, she looked up, but as soon as their eyes met, her courage wavered, and she glanced at the ground again. "Don't let me keep you. Have a good day, Ritai. You've got this." As she walked away, she couldn't stop replaying his bright smile in her mind. Why did it seem so radiant? She felt as though she'd left a part of her heart behind at his house. Dr. Mike watched her leave, guilt clouding his expression. He vowed silently to never touch alcohol again, no matter the circumstances. Most importantly, he resolved to support her in any way he could, to make up for what had happened that night. While the thought of taking responsibility to the point of marriage unsettled him, he hoped that the incident would remain a one-time mistake, with no lasting consequences. After all, he thought to himself, it was just an accident. Wasn't it? Chapter 5. Since that day, Ritai believed Dr. Mike had no recollection of what transpired that fateful night. Her budding feelings for him drove her to seek opportunities to visit him. Sometimes she came to clean his house, other times to water the plants. Each visit was met with generous payment, which left her both grateful and bashful. One thing Ritai noticed was that Dr. Mike had stopped drinking alcohol, even on his days off. Instead, he seemed engrossed in his work on his computer. They rarely talked, only exchanging a few words when she arrived or was about to leave. One day, Dr. Mike disappeared for several days. Aunt Pin explained that he had gone to attend a seminar in another province. Ritai felt an inexplicable sense of loss. He was, after all, her first in many ways. The uncertainty made her restless. One afternoon, as she got off the bus, she saw Dr. Mike's car turning into the street. He stopped the car when he spotted her, lowering the window to speak. "Just getting back, Ritai?" he asked. "Yes, doctor," she replied, smiling shyly and twisting her fingers nervously. "Hop in, I'll drive you home." Before he could repeat the offer, she quickly opened the door and climbed in. Dr. Mike watched her with a fondness akin to an older brother observing a well-behaved younger sibling. As they drove, Ritai couldn't help but notice how pleasant the car smelled and how soothing the music was. She thought to herself how nice it would be to ride in his car more often. "What year are you in now?" "Second year, right?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Yes, doctor," she replied. Dr. Mike reflected on how, despite the incident that night, she still trusted him and smiled at him like this. It left him both relieved and unsettled. Before long, they arrived at her modest home. The sight of its worn exterior filled him with sympathy, while Ritai silently lamented how quickly the ride had ended. "Should I deliver dinner to you tonight, doctor?" she asked eagerly. Her only guaranteed way to see him was to bring his meals. He looked thoughtful before responding, his voice tinged with curiosity. "You're very diligent. Don't you get tired after studying all day?" She shook her head, her hair swaying. He noticed how naturally beautiful she was, clean and unpretentious. Unlike others her age, she didn't rely on makeup to enhance her appearance. "What do you think, doctor?" she pressed. "All right. Go ahead and bring dinner. Just a small portion this time. I think my stomach's been growing lately," he teased. Her beaming smile and cheerful thanks warmed his heart as she gently closed the car door. He couldn't help but compare her demeanor to Mindira's, who would often slam doors in frustration when things didn't go her way. The memory tugged at his heart. He still missed her and often wondered if she was happy with her decision to leave. With a sigh, Dr. Mike drove off, leaving Ritai grinning to herself. Her heart felt full from the brief interaction. Later that evening, Ritai prepared dinner for Dr. Mike. Normally, this was Aunt Pin's task, but lately, Ritai had taken it over herself. "I'll make chicken basil stir-fry tonight. The doctor doesn't like spicy food, so just one chili should do," she murmured, smiling at her own thoughts. However, as she cleaned the chicken, a wave of nausea hit her. She placed the raw meat aside, hoping the feeling would pass, but every time she looked at it, her discomfort grew. In the end, she had to ask Aunt Pin to cook for her. She fibbed, saying Dr. Mike had specifically requested chicken basil. The aroma of the cooking only made her queasiness worse, and she soon found herself vomiting in the bathroom. "Are you all right?" "If you're not, I'll deliver this myself," Aunt Pin offered. "I'm fine really," Ritai replied, forcing a smile. "Don't overwork yourself, child. I know the doctor's kind, but if you push yourself too hard, it won't end well," Aunt Pin warned, concerned her niece was taking on too much. Ritai gave a weak laugh. Her excuse of extra work was just a cover. In truth, she couldn't escape her growing feelings for Dr. Mike. Simply being near him was enough to make her day. His rare smiles were like a reward. Finally, she arrived at Dr. Mike's house with the tiffin carrier, just like always. This time, however, when she stepped inside, she noticed something different. Dr. Mike was drinking again. She froze, conflicted. The memory of that night filled her with apprehension. Dr. Mike looked up from the counter and smiled at her. "Why are you looking at me like you've seen a ghost? Are you drinking again, doctor?" she asked, staying at a safe distance and ready to leave at any moment. He glanced at the bottle in his hand and laughed. "This isn't alcohol. It's grape juice. I brought it back from the vineyard. Come, have a taste." Chapter 6. Ritai could hardly believe it. She was sitting with Dr. Mike, sampling fine grape juice he had brought back from a vineyard. His cheeks had a pinkish hue, as though lightly brushed with blush. Yet, hers were likely even redder, as he kept glancing at her in a way that left her flustered. "It's not often we get to sit and talk, huh?" Dr. Mike started the conversation. You're in your second year, right? Although he already knew, he still asked, and Ritai was more than happy to answer. Yes, doctor. I've heard you're very diligent. If you ever need help with anything, just let me know, he added warmly. Thank you, doctor. She hadn't expected him to be so kind, but what he said next caught her completely off guard. Do you have a boyfriend? Startled, Ritai sputtered her grape juice, accidentally spilling some on his shirt. He gave a sheepish smile and grabbed a tissue to dab at the mess, and she hurried to help. Doctor, I'm so sorry, she exclaimed, her face red with embarrassment. Dr. Mike gently grasped her arm, his expression suddenly serious. Ritai, what really happened that night? Her heart sank. She hadn't been prepared for such a direct question. What night, doctor? I don't know what you mean, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. He held her arm a little tighter. His eyes filled with concern. Tears began to well in hers. Be honest with me, Ritai. Did I do something to you? Her tears spilled over as she tried to find her voice, but the words wouldn't come. That night, I wasn't careful. Did you take emergency contraception? He asked, his tone tinged with worry. Ritai shook her head, unable to meet his gaze. Dr. Mike sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. Well, maybe nothing will come of it, he muttered, releasing her arm. She pressed her lips together, unsure of how to respond. Why didn't you say anything? Why keep it a secret? He pressed. You should have told me, Ritai. In her heart, she wanted to answer. Because you and I are worlds apart. I could never ask anything of you, doctor. I'll admit, I wanted to keep it a secret too, he admitted after a pause. But I can't. I don't know how you managed to stay so quiet about it. His voice softened, almost pleading. I even took leave from work to talk to you about this. Please say something. Ritai finally lifted her head to meet his gaze. Her voice trembled as she confessed. I love you, doctor. Dr. Mike blinked, taken aback. What did you say? I love you, doctor. As for that night, let's just forget it. It was my fault. I shouldn't have gone into your room. If anyone is to blame, it's me. Her words left him speechless. You love me? He finally managed, his tone disbelieving. Do you even understand what love is, Ritai? What is it then, doctor? She asked, her newfound courage evident in her voice. Her eyes, filled with determination, locked onto his as she leaned closer. Now that her feelings were out in the open, she was sure he wouldn't want to see her again. If that was the case, she wanted to take one more step before it was over. Ritai, he stammered as she slid off her chair and moved toward him. Their faces were inches apart when she pressed her lips to his. Caught off guard, Dr. Mike's hesitation melted away. He removed his glasses and pulled her closer, their kiss deepening with surprising intensity. It had been a long time since he'd experienced anything like this, and the emotions came rushing back. She murmured as their kiss lingered, leaving her breathless. Before she knew it, Dr. Mike scooped her up in his arms. Her heart pounded wildly as he carried her toward the sofa. When he set her down, she looked up at him, her thoughts a whirlwind of anticipation and uncertainty. Dr. Mike removed his shirt, revealing his toned physique. Ritai, mesmerized, reached out to touch his chest as if drawn by an invisible force. Chapter 7. What did you just say, doctor? Ritai asked, her voice shaky. Dr. Mike gently guided her toward the bathroom. Go wash up and get dressed. We're going to the pharmacy to get you emergency contraception. You can still take it now. It's not too late. You shouldn't take risks like this again, he explained calmly. Ritai froze in place, her mind racing. The weight of his words was overwhelming, and she barely registered it when he took her arm and led her outside. The sun had already set, casting a dim glow over the quiet street. Get in the car, he urged softly. Doctor, is it safe for my body? She asked hesitantly as she got in. He shook his head, guilt evident in his expression. Even though she had initiated their closeness, he still felt responsible for not exercising better judgment. Taking it occasionally is fine, but frequent use could harm your uterus, he explained. Isn't there another way? I'm scared, she admitted, her voice trembling. Dr. Mike gave her a reassuring smile as he started the car. Her innocence and vulnerability tugged at his heart in a way that momentarily overshadowed his lingering memories of Mindira. "Don't worry, Ritai. If we act quickly, nothing bad will happen," he said, glancing at her. "But what if I'm already pregnant?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The medication only works if you're not pregnant yet. Trust me, it'll be fine," he reassured her. His words brought a small, hesitant smile to her face. Later that evening, after purchasing the medication, he took her to a boutique to pick out a few outfits. The gesture left her wondering. Was this his way of showing affection? Did this mean he might come to love her too? When they returned home, Ritai clutched the new clothes he had bought for her with pure joy. She was so elated that she skipped dinner, prompting Aunt Pin to check on her. The older woman found her niece grinning ear to ear. "What's with the smile? Do you have a boyfriend or something?" Aunt Pin teased. Ritai only smiled in response, leaving her aunt to sigh. "It's best not to rush into these things, Ritai. Focus on finishing school and finding a stable job first. If you get pregnant, everything could fall apart." Ritai's expression shifted at her aunt's words. She put down the bag of clothes and suddenly ran to the open window, where she began to gag uncontrollably. Aunt Pin quickly rushed to her side, gently rubbing her back. "You're still not over this nausea? I think you should see a doctor," Aunt Pin suggested. "It's just gastritis, Auntie," Ritai replied, forcing a weak smile. She held up a bottle of antacid to prove her point. "See? I even bought medicine." Fine. If it's just that, I won't push. So no dinner tonight, I take it?" "No, I'm not hungry," she admitted. In truth, she hadn't felt like eating anything lately. The sight or smell of food made her nauseous, so she stuck to drinking water. When she absolutely needed to eat, she'd nibble on a piece of bread from the convenience store. The next day after class, Dr. Mike surprised her by waiting outside her faculty building. Despite her fatigue, the sight of him lifted her spirits immediately. She sat quietly in the car, overwhelmed by the thought of how far out of her reach he once seemed. Now, sitting beside him, she felt a happiness she couldn't put into words. "Do you want to grab dinner?" he asked casually. "I know a new place nearby, or we can go wherever you'd like." She smiled, unable to hide her joy, and he chuckled as he reached out to gently ruffle her hair. "All right, this new place it is," he decided. The restaurant he chose specialized in health-conscious meals. Dr. Mike explained the importance of balancing spicy and flavorful foods with lighter options to avoid inflammation in the body. The menu featured steamed vegetables, boiled eggs, and grilled chicken, simple yet wholesome. Although the food was plain, Ritai managed to eat a little. "Not very tasty, huh?" Dr. Mike teased, laughing. "It's all right," she replied shyly. Unlike his past with Mindira, where he constantly felt the need to cater to her tastes, Dr. Mike found himself at ease with Ritai. Her easygoing nature was a refreshing change. After dinner, instead of driving her home, Dr. Mike took her back to his house. "Doctor," she started, confused. "Come on, I want to show you something. I've redecorated my room." His tone was playful, but there was a mischievous glint in his eye. Even someone as innocent as Ritai could sense it. Her cheeks turned red, yet when he placed a hand on her shoulder and guided her inside, she didn't resist. Instead, her heart swelled with anticipation. Dr. Mike's room had indeed been rearranged, though the changes weren't significant. Still, Ritai found herself giggling at his attempts to be clever. "Do you want to shower first, Ritai?" he asked gently. This time, the atmosphere was different. Dr. Mike had prepared, ensuring there were no risks involved in their intimacy. The night unfolded with care and passion as he held her close, their connection deepening in a way neither had anticipated. Later that night, Ritai woke to find it was already past 1 a.m. She looked at the sleeping figure beside her, feeling a pang of hesitation about leaving. But as she snuggled back into his warm embrace, she decided to savor the moment a little longer. Just one more night, she thought. This was her reality now, something she had never dared to imagine. Dr. Mike's room, his bed, and his presence had once seemed like distant dreams. Now, they were part of her life, tangible and real. Chapter 8. "Where did you spend the night, Ritai?" Aunt Pin's tone was sharp, laced with irritation and suspicion. While she understood that relationships were natural and hard to control, she felt her niece needed to exercise caution and responsibility. At a friend's house, Auntie, Ritai replied, yawning from exhaustion. The morning had left her dazed, especially after Dr. Mike's passionate affection earlier. I'll go take a nap now. Wait. Aunt Pin's voice rose, and she grabbed Ritai's arm. Her eyes widened in shock as she noticed a mark on her niece's neck. What's that on your neck? Is that a hickey? Aunt Pin pulled her closer to examine her further. Though Ritai didn't feel any physical pain, the telltale marks on her neck revealed Dr. Mike's passionate embrace. Embarrassed, Ritai quickly covered them with her hands. Who is it? Who's the man? Aunt Pin demanded loudly, her voice echoing through the house. Auntie! Ritai snapped, her patience wearing thin for the first time. Why are you yelling at me like this? She avoided escalating the situation further by retreating to her bedroom, but Aunt Pin wasn't ready to drop the matter. Don't you walk away from me. Answer me. Aunt Pin called after her. Can't you just let me have my freedom for once? Ritai shouted back, turning on her aunt with a force that shocked them both. Ritai! Aunt Pin whispered, her hand clutching her chest in disbelief. Realizing how harsh her words sounded, Ritai felt a pang of guilt but didn't apologize. Instead, she closed the door behind her, shutting herself inside her room. Aunt Pin stood frozen in place. Since raising Ritai as a baby, she had never experienced such defiance from her. While Ritai could be mischievous at times, she had never shown outright disrespect, until today. Glancing at a photo of herself holding a young Ritai at a children's event, Aunt Pin's thoughts wandered. She remembered skipping work that day to cheer her niece on in a dance competition. The sacrifices she made for Ritai had always been out of love. Tears welled up in her eyes as she muttered, "What kind of man has taught you this, Ritai? Who is he? I'll go deal with him myself." Inside her room, Ritai sat with her knees hugged to her chest, hands covering her ears. Her aunt's sobs were loud and heart-wrenching. She glanced at the door, torn between apologizing and standing her ground. Part of her felt she was old enough to make her own choices without Aunt Pin interfering. "Doctor, please help me," she murmured, thinking only of Dr. Mike. Her first love had her completely captivated. She was lost in thoughts of him, his presence, his scent, and her desire to be near him at all times. 3 hours later, hunger finally forced Ritai out of bed. She opened her door cautiously, hoping her aunt wasn't around to confront her again. To her surprise, Aunt Pin was sitting quietly by the wall, staring at the faint green food cover on the table. Hearing footsteps, she turned to look at Ritai. "Come eat. I've made food," Aunt Pin said softly. She gestured toward the table, showing Ritai where the meal was waiting. Without a word, she stood and started to leave the room, giving her niece space to eat without tension. "Auntie," Ritai called hesitantly. "I'm going to the market," Aunt Pin replied, turning back briefly. "I need to buy ingredients for the doctor's order. Just eat your food." Ritai watched her leave and tears began to stream down her face. She regretted yelling at her aunt and vowed to make amends. Sitting at the table, she lifted the food cover to find an array of warm dishes. An omelette, sour curry, and rice. She ate her meal quietly, her tears mixing with each bite. Almost 2 hours later, Aunt Pin returned with groceries. Ritai rushed to meet her at the door, ready to carry the bags. "Why so much food? The doctor usually orders just a little," she asked, noticing the unusually large quantity. As Aunt Pin started preparing fish for soup, she replied, "I'm not sure. The market folks mentioned seeing a car like the one his wife used to drive parked at his house. But who knows how reliable that gossip is." Ritai froze, her heart sinking. She felt a creeping unease, like waiting anxiously for exam results. "Don't think I'm nagging, Ritai," Aunt Pin said, her tone gentle. "I just want you to be careful. You've got your whole future ahead of you." "Yes, Auntie," Ritai replied, her voice small. "If things get serious, you should bring him here for a blessing. It's better to do things the proper way." It wasn't an order, but rather a heartfelt plea from someone who only wanted the best for her. Overwhelmed, Ritai dropped to her knees and bowed deeply before her aunt. "I'm sorry, Auntie. I'm so sorry," she cried. "It's all right. It's all right, my dear." "I'm sorry too for trying to control you all the time," Aunt Pin said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Auntie, I promise. I'll bring him here for a blessing. I'll make sure of it." "That's good to hear, Ritai. That's very good, Aunt Pin said, stroking her niece's hair through her tears. Ritai's heart swelled with determination. She believed wholeheartedly that Dr. Mike would step up to formalize their relationship. He was a good man, and just thinking of him filled her with unwavering confidence. Chapter 9. Oh, you're the one who delivers the meals, aren't you? The person who came out to receive the tiffin carrier was a stunningly beautiful woman, her complexion smooth like polished stone, lips painted a striking red. She smiled warmly at Ritai, reaching out for the carrier. But Ritai froze, her entire body stiff from head to toe. Mindira, puzzled by her reaction, tilted her head slightly just as Dr. Mike appeared behind her. Mindira, is something wrong? He asked, his voice calm but with a trace of concern. It's just. Dr. Mike's gaze shifted to Ritai through his glasses, his expression unreadable. Feeling her chest tighten, Ritai quickly forced a smile, her hand trembling as she handed the tiffin carrier to Mindira. Yes, sorry. I was just startled. It's just that, you're so beautiful, she blurted out nervously. Mindira's expression softened, a small smile forming on her lips. Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. Enjoy your meal. I should go now, Ritai said hurriedly, retreating before her emotions could betray her further. She walked away briskly, but her steps felt heavy, the distance to her usual spot seeming to stretch endlessly. Eventually, she stopped beneath a tree, her body racked with sobs as she vomited the contents of her stomach. Inside the house, Mindira turned to face her ex-husband, her gaze sharp. Are you involved with that girl? She asked bluntly. Ha! What are you talking about? Dr. Mike replied, his expression a mix of surprise and defensiveness. The way she looked at you, I could see it immediately. Aren't you going to explain to her that we're not back together? Dr. Mike adjusted his glasses, his face flushing. What are you saying, Mindira? Let's just eat. I'm hungry. Mindira sighed, seeing right through his discomfort. She had only intended to stay the night for a business matter involving the property they co-owned, but his unease made the situation all the more awkward. They ate in near silence, with Dr. Mike clearly preoccupied. See, this is one of your flaws, Mindira remarked, breaking the silence. Why do you keep everything bottled up? Why can't you just explain things? Dr. Mike didn't respond, but her words hit home. If you keep quiet like this, your little girlfriend might take it the wrong way and spiral out of control. Finally, Dr. Mike placed his spoon down and looked at her. I'll go talk to her. Mindira smiled approvingly. Go ahead. You should. Dr. Mike didn't take his car but instead walked briskly toward Ritai's home. He arrived to find Aunt Pin stepping outside to throw away some trash. Oh, doctor. What brings you here? Are you placing an order for tomorrow? Aunt Pin asked cheerfully. No, actually. He hesitated. Is Ritai home? Aunt Pin blinked, her brow furrowing. Something about his question seemed odd. She's not back yet. She went to deliver your meal. Didn't she come home after that? Dr. Mike's worry deepened. He pulled out his phone to call Ritai, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed. Aunt Pin's eyes widened. She's not answering, he muttered to himself. Doctor, you have her number? Aunt Pin asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. Before he could respond, the rumble of a motorcycle broke the silence. A motorbike taxi pulled up, and Ritai stepped off, paying the driver before turning to face them. Her eyes darted between Dr. Mike and her aunt before she spoke. What are you doing here? She asked flatly. The doctor came to see you, Aunt Pin said, narrowing her eyes at him. Sensing the tension, Dr. Mike quickly interjected. May I speak with her privately, Aunt Pin? He asked. Though clearly curious, Aunt Pin stepped aside, allowing them space. Ritai led Dr. Mike to a darker corner of the yard, her demeanor cold and distant. What do you want to talk about, doctor? She asked, her tone sharp. What you saw earlier was, he began. Your wife. I know, she cut him off, her voice laced with pain. Her next words hit him like a punch. Doctor, I'm pregnant. 2 months. Dr. Mike's face went pale, his mind reeling. You mean? Yes, she snapped, tears streaming down her face. It's from that night. You were drunk, doctor. You didn't even care. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder in an attempt to calm her. Ritai, please, let's talk this through. She shrugged him off, her voice rising. I need 30,000 baht. No, make it 50,000. That should cover it. What? He whispered, his voice faltering. I'm going to terminate it. This thing will ruin my life. I don't have the money for it, but you do. It's not much for you, is it, doctor? Ritai, he began, his voice soft with disbelief. Send the money tonight. I'll text you my account number. I'll handle it tomorrow, she said coldly, turning away as her tears fell silently. Her words stung him deeply, and yet he nodded, hoping to ease her anguish for the moment. But to his surprise, she seemed even more upset that he agreed so easily. Yes, I'll wait, she said, brushing past him. As she walked back to the house, he reached for her arm again, but she pulled away and hurried inside. Inside, Aunt Pin was waiting, her expression unreadable. Ritai paused, bracing herself for a lecture, but instead, her aunt pulled her into a warm embrace, stroking her hair gently. I'm sorry, Auntie, Ritai whispered through her sobs. It's all right, my dear. It's all right, Aunt Pin replied softly. Whatever you decide, make sure it's something you can live with. Will it be wrong if I? Ritai asked hesitantly, glancing down at her flat stomach. If it makes you suffer, then yes, it's wrong. But only you can answer that, Ritai, Aunt Pin said. She paused before adding, but it would be even worse if the child grows up without love or care from their parents. Do you understand? Tears flowed freely as Ritai nodded. Deep down, she knew her aunt's words held the truth she needed to hear. Chapter 10. That night, Dr. Mike didn't transfer the money as Ritai had demanded. The next morning, he took Mindira to the district office to handle some property-related paperwork. As Ritai arrived at his house to demand the money, she caught sight of his car pulling away. Her heart sank, her pain quickly turning into anger. So, I'm not even worth a few thousand baht, she muttered bitterly. She looked down at her stomach, speaking as though addressing the life inside her. You're worthless. Remember that. I don't love you either, she said, tears streaming down her face. She raised her hand as if to strike her abdomen but stopped short, clenching her fist and storming back home instead. Once she arrived, she told her aunt, Auntie, I want to leave. I need to go somewhere else for a while. Aunt Pin, sensing her niece's despair, was at a loss for how to help. Where would you go, Ritai? You're carrying a baby. What if something happens to you? I just can't stand seeing him and his wife anymore. It's just a few thousand baht. Why is he so cruel? Aunt Pin opened her mouth as if to reason with her, but decided against it. Instead, she turned to gut the fish she was preparing for a wealthy client's meal delivery. Do what you think is best, then. The atmosphere in the house was heavy with frustration and despair. Ritai, overwhelmed by her emotions, skipped her classes and spent most of her time staring blankly at the walls. Aunt Pin felt her own anger simmering as well. 3 measly tens of thousands, and he couldn't give it to her? Humph! She fumed, slamming her knife into the cutting board. Maybe I should give that doctor a piece of my mind. Later that day, Dr. Mike had ordered tom yum soup. Seized by a vengeful impulse, Aunt Pin added a hefty dose of slad, a plant known to induce severe purging, into the broth before taking the tiffin carrier to his house herself. Dr. Mike answered the door, his smile faltering slightly when he saw it was Aunt Pin instead of Ritai. Where's the lady of the house? She asked, her eyes glinting with mischief. Oh, Mindira? She's gone. She won't be coming back, he replied casually. Aunt Pin raised an eyebrow, prompting him to elaborate further. We're not back together or anything. She just stayed over for one night because we needed to sort out some property documents. That's all. Is that so? Aunt Pin drew out her words, her grip tightening on the tiffin carrier. She made a move to leave. Wait, Auntie. What about the tiffin? Dr. Mike asked. Oh, It's not for you actually, she blurted out, her guilt beginning to surface. Dr. Mike tilted his head in confusion, and Aunt Pin sighed heavily before confessing. I put slad in the soup because I was angry. Angry for Ritai. Why didn't you send her the money? She's in so much pain and full of resentment. Dr. Mike's expression softened with understanding. I didn't want her to make a rash decision she might regret later. What if she realizes too late that she didn't want to go through with it? Aunt Pin let out a sharp breath. Are you saying you want to keep the child, doctor? What do you think, Auntie? He asked, his gaze earnest. She frowned, conflicted. That's for you and her to decide. But you haven't said anything to her, have you? What if she does something drastic? How will you live with that? Her words struck a chord. Both of them stood there, locked in thought, until Aunt Pin let out a gasp and hurried back toward the house. Dr. Mike quickly followed, closing the gate behind him as he called out, "Wait for me, Auntie." When they reached the house, it was eerily silent. Aunt Pin placed the tiffin carrier in a basin and went to Ritai's room, pressing her ear to the door. Nothing. Dr. Mike gave her a questioning look, and Aunt Pin frowned in concern. "Maybe she's sleeping," she whispered. "Is the door locked?" he asked. "Probably. But she never locks the window," Aunt Pin replied. "I'll check," Dr. Mike said, already moving toward the side of the house. The wind rattled the wind chimes hanging near the window, filling the air with an eerie melody. Despite his professional demeanor, Dr. Mike hadn't climbed anything since his younger years. Yet here he was, scaling the old wooden frame of the house. The structure creaked ominously beneath his weight, but his regular gym visits proved invaluable, allowing him to pull himself up and peer through the window. What he saw made his stomach drop. Ritai was lying curled on the floor, her hair disheveled and her face pale. "Ritai!" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. Her body didn't move. Dr. Mike climbed through the window, stumbling slightly as he landed inside. Outside, Aunt Pin called out anxiously, "Doctor, how is she?" Dr. Mike knelt beside Ritai, checking her pulse. It was faint but steady. Relief washed over him as he opened the door for Aunt Pin. "She's unconscious. Likely from low blood sugar and dehydration. I'll take her to the hospital immediately. Please wait while I get my car," he said urgently. Aunt Pin nodded, her tears streaming. "Oh, Ritai. You barely eat, and now this. Oh, my poor girl." As Dr. Mike stepped outside, he paused, overcome with guilt. His actions had led to this. His hesitation, his inability to handle the situation properly. Clenching his fists, he made a silent vow to himself. This time, he wouldn't make the same mistakes. This time he would make things right. Chapter 11. Time passed, and Ritai slowly began to regain consciousness. The dream lingered in her mind. A long road stretched before her, with only a small child walking beside her. The child was endearing, with a bright and innocent smile. "Mom, do you love me?" the child asked, his voice sweet and pleading. The tender sound melted her heart. She felt an inexplicable affection for the boy. Together, they seemed to be heading somewhere unknown. "Of course I love you." "Wait, Mom. Am I your mom?" she asked in confusion. The boy's smile faded, replaced by a sorrowful expression. Tears began streaming down his face, and the sound of his cries grew piercing and unbearable. "Doctor, how's she doing?" Aunt Pin asked anxiously. Dr. Mike entered the hospital room in his pristine white coat, accompanied by a nurse. He glanced at Ritai's pale form on the bed, his expression serious. "She hasn't woken up yet, Doctor," Aunt Pin said, gripping her niece's arm tightly. "She'll wake up soon, Auntie. Why don't you take a break in the meantime?" he suggested kindly. "No, I'll stay until she wakes up," Aunt Pin insisted firmly. The room fell silent once more until, finally, Ritai opened her eyes. Her surroundings came into focus, revealing the clean and private hospital room. "You're awake, Ritai. Are you hungry?" Aunt Pin asked eagerly. "Water. I need water," she croaked weakly. Aunt Pin quickly brought a glass with a straw, helping her drink. Ritai gulped down nearly half the glass before Aunt Pin gently stopped her. "Take it slow," Aunt Pin cautioned. "What happened, Auntie?" Ritai asked after catching her breath. "You fainted, dear. You've been so stressed and exhausted," Aunt Pin replied, her tone filled with concern. "I'm sorry, Auntie. I've caused you so much trouble," Ritai murmured, guilt weighing heavy on her. "Don't be ridiculous. You're my niece, Ritai. I've cared for you since you were just a baby, and I'll always look after you," Aunt Pin said, her voice trembling with emotion. Ritai's chest tightened with remorse. "I shouldn't have fallen for the doctor. I shouldn't have gotten pregnant." "Enough of that nonsense," Aunt Pin interrupted. "Do you know who brought you to the hospital?" "Dr. Mike did." Hearing this, Ritai pressed her lips together tightly. Why did he bother? He should have just let me. Watch your mouth, girl. He helped because he cares about you and the baby, Aunt Pin scolded. Auntie. What did you just say? I said he cares about you and the baby. The reason he didn't send you the money was that he didn't want you making rash decisions in anger. He wants you to think things through. He's ready to take responsibility. Ritai blinked, struggling to process her aunt's words. Yesterday felt like a different lifetime compared to what she was hearing now. You must have misunderstood, Auntie. Aunt Pin sighed, recognizing her niece's confusion. All right. Are you hungry? Let me get you something to eat. I'm not hungry, Ritai replied quietly. Well, you'd better start feeling hungry soon. If you don't eat, you'll faint again, Aunt Pin retorted. When her aunt left to fetch some food, the room grew quiet again. The door creaked open moments later, and Ritai didn't bother to turn around, assuming her aunt had forgotten her wallet as usual. But it wasn't Aunt Pin. How are you feeling, Ritai? Better than before? A familiar gentle voice asked. Startled, Ritai turned her head to see Dr. Mike pulling up a chair beside her. Her heart raced, torn between love and resentment. Doctor, she stammered. Yes, it's me, he said softly, reaching out to touch her hand. The tenderness in his voice and the warmth in his touch brought tears to her eyes. She wanted to cry, and when she did, he let her. He gently wiped away her tears with his fingers. I'm sorry for making you misunderstand, he said. What misunderstanding, doctor? She asked, her voice tinged with sadness. Dr. Mike smiled kindly, though his heart ached for her. He didn't know when he'd started caring for this young woman so deeply. The misunderstanding about Mindira staying at my house. She's your wife, isn't she? Ritai said bitterly. Congratulations. Dr. Mike chuckled lightly. I told you, Ritai, you've misunderstood. It's partly my fault for not explaining earlier. Mindira and I are no longer together. She only stayed at my house because of some paperwork. Why though? Don't you still love her? She asked hesitantly. I do. But not the way I used to. I care for her as a friend. Nothing more. For the first time, Ritai felt like the heroine in one of those evening dramas where the male lead came to reconcile with her. Could it really be happening? Ritai, Dr. Mike continued, his voice filled with sincerity. I'm sorry for everything. Mindira always said I was useless at relationships, and she was right. I made you suffer because of it. The anger and bitterness in Ritai's heart began to dissolve, replaced by her growing affection for him. She looked at him with teary eyes. That doesn't matter, doctor. To me, you're the kindest man I've ever known. You silly girl, he said with a chuckle. I'm much older than you. Why would you choose someone like me? His question was endearing, and she couldn't help but smile. When he excused himself to return to work, Ritai felt her heart swell with happiness. Aunt Pin returned with rice porridge, and to her surprise, Ritai finished the entire bowl. You ate it all? I only bought a small portion, thinking you wouldn't eat much. Aunt Pin exclaimed. It was delicious, Ritai said with a grin. Really? Aunt Pin asked skeptically. The truth was, it wasn't the food that made her happy. It was the doctor's visit. His words had given her hope, and for the first time, she felt their relationship might truly have a chance. But as Dr. Mike had once said, she was still young. She couldn't foresee the challenges and consequences the future might bring, and how much they could affect her life. Chapter 12.1. Rumors about Ritai's pregnancy spread like wildfire throughout the neighborhood. Whispers filled the streets, and the father's identity as Dr. Mike only fueled the gossip. The stark difference in their social standings made the scandal all the more tantalizing for the gossip-mongers, but it was Ritai who bore the brunt of their judgment. Oh, I thought she was this naive, clueless girl. Turns out she's quite cunning. Of all people, she snagged a doctor. One neighbor sneered. Others chimed in. Didn't she deliver food to the doctor every day? That must have been her excuse to lure him in. Poor Dr. Mike. He must have been tricked. Such a pity, another speculated. Even Aunt Pin couldn't escape the fallout. When she went to the market, the gossipers took aim at her too, questioning her parenting skills. What kind of upbringing did you give her, Auntie Pin, to turn out like that? One bold customer taunted. Aunt Pin, hands on her hips, retorted without hesitation. Do you want me to shove my foot in your mouth? Hey, no need to get so aggressive, Pin. I'm just asking. The woman snapped back. You've got some nerve, you foul-mouthed hag. Your son went to jail for assaulting a woman, and I never said a word about it. Who's the disgrace here? Aunt Pin shot back, storming off empty-handed. At home, Ritai noticed her aunt's distress and felt a wave of guilt. She was the cause of all this. If only she hadn't meddled in the doctor's affairs that night, none of this would have happened. Auntie, why don't we move somewhere else for a while? Ritai suggested, her voice soft. That might be for the best, Aunt Pin agreed with a sigh. I'm tired of dealing with these gossiping crows. The two decided to leave their home temporarily. Aunt Pin, however, had no intention of selling the house. She figured they would return eventually. Don't you think you should at least say goodbye to the doctor before we leave? Aunt Pin asked. Do you think that's a good idea? Ritai hesitated. It's better to leave on good terms. Go, her aunt urged. When Ritai went to see Dr. Mike, he was taken aback by her announcement. Ritai, I'm so sorry, he said earnestly. I've been so busy lately that I completely forgot to address this. Please don't leave. I'll talk to my parents and arrange for them to come and formally ask for your hand. Ritai was stunned, speechless for a moment. Are you serious, doctor? Of course. Tell Aunt Pin to wait. I'll contact my parents right away, he assured her. Ritai rushed back home, elated. But to her surprise, Aunt Pin didn't share her enthusiasm. Instead, her face was clouded with worry. Aren't you happy, Auntie? The doctor wants to marry me. Or, do you not trust him? Ritai asked, concerned. It's not Dr. Mike I'm worried about. It's his parents, Aunt Pin admitted. Aunt Pin knew Dr. Mike's character, but his parents were a different story. From what she'd heard, they were prominent figures in society. People who might not accept her niece as their daughter-in-law or the unborn child as their grandchild. If things went poorly, it would only add to Ritai's stress. Aunt Pin glanced at her niece's beaming face, wanting to voice her concerns. But the joy radiating from Ritai's expression made her swallow her words. That night, Ritai couldn't sleep. She spoke to her baby with excitement. Sweetheart, your grandparents are coming to meet us tomorrow. Aren't you excited? She whispered, cradling her stomach. Her youthful naivety kept her from considering the potential challenges ahead. Instead, she dreamed of a grand wedding and a life filled with happiness. Chapter 12.2. The day finally arrived. Dr. Mike took leave from work to escort Aunt Pin and Ritai to meet his parents at a hotel. His parents had flown in on a direct flight that morning. When Aunt Pin saw Dr. Mike's parents, she couldn't help but swallow hard. They carried an air of refinement, dressed impeccably in clothing that was a world apart from her own. Compared to them, she felt like a servant standing before her masters. Good day, Father, Mother. This is Ritai and Aunt Pin, Dr. Mike said, introducing them. Aunt Pin, Ritai, these are my parents. Ritai and Aunt Pin raised their hands in a polite Y. Dr. Mike's parents returned the gesture with hesitant smiles. The atmosphere was stiff and awkward, the tension palpable. Dr. Mike's parents exchanged glances, their expressions uneasy. Aunt Pin's own discomfort grew tenfold. Sensing the unease, Dr. Mike decided to break the silence, guiding Aunt Pin and Ritai to their seats and signaling for menus to order food. But his father interrupted him. We can't stay long, Mike. No need to order anything. Yes, let's just get this over with. Your mother and I have another appointment, his mother added. Dr. Mike knew well that his parents were not keen on accepting Ritai as their daughter-in-law. The stark difference in social status between Ritai and their family was undeniable, and he had anticipated their resistance. But he had made his decision to marry her, and he believed every problem had a solution. It's not often we're all together. Let's have a meal, even if it's a quick one, Dr. Mike said with a boyish charm that softened his parents' resolve. Fine, his father relented. But nothing too elaborate. Dr. Mike took it upon himself to steer the conversation, glossing over his parents' discomfort and Aunt Pin's anxious glances. Thankfully, Ritai remained composed, her pure-hearted demeanor shining through. When the food arrived, it was beautifully presented, but no one seemed eager to touch their plates. Taking the lead, Dr. Mike slid each dish toward the others, determined to ease the tension. Aunt Pin, the The glass noodle shrimp here is excellent. Please give it a try, he said warmly. Thank you, Aunt Pin replied, hesitantly taking a bite. Mother, I ordered the tilapia. It's your favorite, prepared just the way you like it, Dr. Mike said with a grin. And father, this grilled beef is exceptional. The chef here uses precise heat control to ensure perfect tenderness, he added, turning to his father. Finally, he turned to Ritai and placed a portion of chili sauce-covered beef on her plate. Ritai, you should eat more. It's good for the baby. Dr. Mike's parents watched quietly as their son fussed over Ritai, showing care and gentleness. Despite their initial reluctance, they began eating the dishes he had thoughtfully chosen. Bite after bite, the meal gradually softened the atmosphere. Mike, do you come to this restaurant often? His mother asked, breaking the silence. After you divorced Mindira, I mean. She had heard that her son had fallen into despair and turned to drinking after the divorce, but seeing him now, healthy and vibrant, she realized those rumors were far from the truth. Not at all, Dr. Mike replied cheerfully. It's all thanks to Aunt Pin. She's been cooking and delivering fresh meals to me every day. Her food is excellent. She doesn't use MSG or artificial seasonings. His mother turned her gaze to Aunt Pin for the first time, offering a small smile. It's rare to find someone who avoids MSG these days. Most vendors use it to keep customers coming back. That's true, his father chimed in. When you find someone who doesn't use it, you should stick with them. Aunt Pin felt a bit more at ease, even managing a modest smile. I've always prioritized my customers' health, treating them like family. Besides, my cooking is flavorful enough without MSG. Her words carried a touch of pride, earning a warm smile from Dr. Mike. The tension in the room eased further, and the mood lightened noticeably. Dr. Mike's parents had always been wary of others, their mistrust rooted in past betrayals. Years ago, their generosity had been exploited by someone they tried to help, resulting in significant financial losses. Dr. Mike still remembered that painful chapter from his childhood. This was why he didn't judge his parents for their initial reactions. Instead, he sought to prove that Aunt Pin and Ritai, though poor, were good and honest people. Not everyone was selfish or untrustworthy. There was kindness and integrity in every walk of life. For the first time since they sat down, Dr. Mike felt a glimmer of hope that his family might find common ground. Chapter 13. Time passed, and the food on the table was gone. Dr. Mike's parents, Aunt Pin, and even Ritai were now chatting comfortably, a stark contrast to their initial awkwardness. Shall I order more food? Dr. Mike asked with a grin. Oh, I almost forgot. You both have another appointment. His parents exchanged glances, their expressions softening with guilt. They felt ashamed for prejudging Aunt Pin and Ritai earlier, their distrust rooted in painful past experiences that were hard to forget. That's right, his mother replied. Let's meet again when it's time to plan the invitations. As for the wedding dress and venue, I'll leave those decisions to you, dear. Ritai bowed deeply in gratitude, her optimism validated. Aunt Pin, however, interjected with a measured tone. To be honest, I don't care much about fancy weddings. What matters is how the couple builds their life together. But I suppose, given you only have one son, a wedding might be necessary, she remarked. Dr. Mike's mother placed a gentle hand over Aunt Pin's and responded kindly. It's not just because Mike is our only son. I want that day to be a cherished memory for everyone involved. Pin, feel free to go all out. Money won't be an issue. Aunt Pin was touched but also hesitant. Oh, there's no need. I can manage just fine, haha. The meeting concluded smoothly, with Dr. Mike's parents promising to visit again soon. After bidding them farewell, Dr. Mike drove Aunt Pin home before taking Ritai for a drive to have a more private discussion. Doctor, aren't you embarrassed to have a wife who's poor? Ritai asked hesitantly. She couldn't help but recall the judgmental looks from some nurses at the hospital, especially after news of her pregnancy with the most handsome doctor in the building spread. Has your poverty ever hurt anyone? Dr. Mike asked in return. Ritai knew her financial status hadn't harmed anyone, but she worried others might look down on her, deeming her unworthy of someone like him. When she didn't reply, Dr. Mike continued, his tone a blend of wisdom and reassurance, as if speaking to both a mentee and a life partner. Remember this, Ritai. We're all born with nothing. Wealth and possessions come later. And when we die, we leave with nothing again. All that remains are stories. Some worth remembering, and others better forgotten. So long as we live with integrity, work hard, and treat others kindly, there's no need to fret over what people say. He rolled down the window, letting in a cool breeze. Ritai took a deep breath of fresh air, feeling her worries lift. The oppressive despair she'd felt in recent days melted away. Doctor. May I ask you one last question? She ventured. Dr. Mike smiled. I'm free all day today. Ask away. Do you love me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Their relationship had begun by chance, an accident that led to her pregnancy. She knew it didn't guarantee he loved her. Not in the romantic way she dreamed of. Of course I do, he replied without hesitation. What did you say? She asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. I said I love you. I don't know what love means to you, but to me, it's about connection, the bond we've built, and the future we're going to create together. He turned to look at her, his expression gentle. And you, Ritai? Do you love me? She glared at him playfully. Do you even need to ask? Of course I do. If she didn't, why would she have been so devastated when she thought he wouldn't take responsibility? Now, with all misunderstandings cleared, she felt like she was on the brink of a new and happy chapter with him. You know, she said thoughtfully, I'm glad you were single that day. If you weren't, I'd never have had a chance to love you. Though she knew others might find her selfish for thinking that way, especially since it meant wishing for his divorce, her feelings were genuine. In her heart, she believed he and his ex-wife were better suited for each other, but life had led her here. What are you thinking about? Dr. Mike asked. I'm talking to our baby, she replied, placing a hand on her slightly rounded belly, a testament to the love they now shared. Tell the baby I'll come say hello tonight, he joked, his laughter light and carefree. Ritai turned to the window, her face lit with a radiant smile. She gazed at the passing scenery, her heart brimming with happiness. Subscribe now for more interesting stories.